Welcome back. Here we go with Rhetorical Basics lessons number 4 and 5. This is a special double issue, so get excited. Of course, you're all rhetorical rock stars, so you wouldn't feel any other way than to be excited to talk about tone and rhetorical questioning. So, as always, this is prepared by me, Mr. Lassard, and it's adapted from the requirements that the College Board has said they want you to know for the AP Language and Composition class. So let's get started with tone. First, let's talk about what tone is, because a lot of people get confused. I hear this mistake made all the time in offhand comments when people are talking about tone, what they really mean is mood, and when they're talking about mood, what they really mean is tone. So let's be clear on what tone is. Tone is the feeling conveyed by a writer toward their subject. So if we look at the pictures on the right, let's just assume that the first picture, the subject is Batman, and the second picture, the subject is Superman. So if we're talking about the tone toward Batman in this picture, we're talking about a tone of I guess, mystery, of concealment, of darkness. If we're talking about the tone towards Superman, we're talking about a tone of openness and hope and maybe progression. And these are conveyed by the different ways that the images are created. And that's not to be confused with the mood of each piece. Like the mood is of the Batman one is one of mystery, is one of kind of despair, I guess, of depression, and the mood of the one on the right is probably one of happiness and hope and lightheartedness. And so there's a slight difference between the tone, which is directed at a thing, and the mood, which is just the overall feeling of the piece. So why is this important to consider, and what rhetorical function does it have? Well, what really cultivating your tone does is it brings out the empathy or the sympathy that you want from your audience toward your position, or in other cases when you don't carefully cultivate the tone, it can bring out antipathy toward your position. If you don't know how or what tone you're conveying toward your subject, and that tone ends up being one of one that the audience can't connect with, then ultimately you're losing ground emotionally with your audience on your position. And you want your audience to feel empathetic or sympathetic, which are slightly different. Empathetic is when we feel the same way as the writer. Sympathetic is when we understand what the writer is feeling. We want feelings of empathy and sympathy, not antipathy, and a lot of that can come from how we create tone in our writing. This is especially important when you think about the fact that, especially when we're arguing with people who don't share the same feelings toward the subject as others might. So as we might. So if we get our tone just right, then we can change the emotions of the audience into one that's more at least sympathetic, if not empathetic, toward our subject, which is a hard thing to do. So let's look at two examples. As a lot of you know, there's a homelessness crisis in Seattle and really in the nation at the moment. And so I'm going to be using that as kind of the jumping off point for these two examples. The first example is a statement about homelessness in Seattle where the writer is expressing compassion toward the idea of homelessness in Seattle. So it goes like this. When a person's entire existence is contained in a shopping cart and a tent that at any moment could be stolen, vandalized, or even thrown out by the city, can't we attempt to put aside our exasperation and remember that behind all of it is a human being doing their best to make their way in the world? So we can see that there's kind of this compassionate, we're taking homelessness and we're hopefully conveying that we have compassion for them, that we suffer with them when we see it, that we understand that these are people who are down on their luck, and we want to convey that feeling through our words toward homelessness in Seattle. On the other side of that, we can take a tone of frustration toward homelessness, and we can convey essentially the same information as the first statement, but in a much different way. So if we read it, it goes like this. Clearly, the people who end up homeless have fallen on hard times, but is it really too much to ask that if they insist on parking their shopping carts and tents on streets that my tax dollars pay to maintain, they at least make an attempt at tidiness so that the city doesn't end up having to do it for them? And in this case, again, we've got basically the same information. There are people on the street that the city can come in and clean up for them, all of these things. However, in this case, instead of conveying compassion toward this problem, we're conveying the frustration that goes along with it. And depending on the argument that we're making and who we're arguing to, then one or the other of these is going to be more effective when it comes to hopefully, actually coming up with some kind of policy to fix the problem. What I want you to notice is that diction largely determines the tone here. So when we're conveying compassion toward homelessness, we use kind of softer words. We're encouraging people to put aside exasperation. We use the word human being. They're doing their best. Things like that are conveying this compassion, whereas with the frustration, we end up conveying ideas of frustration through harder words like insist and my tax dollars. We have, at least make an attempt, right? So like a lot of that diction conveys the feeling that we have toward the issue, toward the subject. I want you to notice one other thing here, and that each of these basically make their argument and even convey an element of tone, an element of their tone through the second half of their statement. And each of those second halves of the statements use something called rhetorical questioning, which gets us to the second part of this double issue lesson. So what is rhetorical questioning? It's something that probably all of you do without even thinking about it, just like you convey tone without even thinking about it, except when it's rhetorical, it should be deliberate, right? So a rhetorical question is the strategy of using unanswered questions with the intent of leading your audience to the desired conclusion. So essentially, you're asking a question that has an obvious answer so that it's hard for the audience, it's difficult for the audience to answer in a way that you didn't already intend for them to answer. And the function of this, the usefulness of this function is that it gives the illusion of control to the audience. When you allow the audience to answer the question, they feel as though they've arrived at the conclusion on their own. However, when you effectively use rhetorical questioning, you're planting the conclusion in their mind already. Like you're expecting them to answer a certain way because there's really no other way to answer the question. And if you were to rewind to the previous slide, you would see that it's hard not to answer the question in either a compassionate way or a frustrated way. So let's look at a couple more examples here. In this example, this first example is from Sojourner Truth, who was a former slave and then a women's suffrage advocate in the 19th century. And this is her take on the worth of women of color. She says, "Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery, and when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me, and ain't I a woman?" So this repetition of the rhetorical question, ain't I a woman? Yes, of course she's a woman, right? Like she's, if you were to have been where she was making this speech, like there would be no question she's a woman. So the answer is obviously yes, but she's planting that obvious answer yes within this information that she can plow and plant, that that she can eat as much and she can take as much punishment. And not only that, but she can also bear children and has had to bear the grief of watching them sold off to slavery. And so planting this obvious question, yes, she's a woman who's capable of doing all these things, helps her make the argument clear that yes, that not only women, but women of color are worthy of the respect that she's arguing in favor of. On the flip side of that, we can look at an example from Barack Obama, who uses rhetorical questioning to argue for the rights of immigrants to gain the opportunity and to be treated with decency that the United States says that it gives to these immigrants. So he says, "Are we a nation that tolerates the hypocrisy of a system where workers who pick our fruit and make our beds never have a chance to get right by the law? Are we a nation that accepts the cruelty of ripping children from their parents' arms? Or are we a nation that values families and works to keep them together?" And so if we look at the three questions that he asks, the obvious answer for any American who claims to live up to the ideals of the American dream, the obvious answer to that is yes, to the first question, do we tolerate this hypocrisy? Well, no, we don't tolerate hypocrisy. Are we a nation that accepts the cruelty of ripping children from their... No, of course we don't. Or are we a nation that values families and works to keep them together? Yes. So you can imagine that when he proposes that we change the way that we treat immigrants in the country, then he's already planted the idea of, no, we don't treat people in these ways, but we do treat them in ways that are respectful of their families. Then the idea that then having asked those questions and led you to those answers without having told you the answers, then you're more likely to agree with his position when he proposes it. And so what I'd like you to consider are, how can we use tone and rhetorical questioning together to make an even stronger argument? We'll work on that in your practice.